So welcome to this week's Let's Talk Business. Thank you guys for typing in there. We'll be talking about your profit and loss report or statement today. And we have Aaron Rodriguez on the line, who I'll hand it over to in just a few moments. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. So since it is, if you could mute yourself in between asking questions, I think it looks like most of you have already done that. But just so that we don't have, kids crying and dogs barking in the background. If you need to know how, just hit this little green microphone button, either on the control panel or next to your name. If you're having trouble hearing for any reason, I highly recommend calling in with the phone. If you're not having any issues with the computer speakers, though, no need to change. And then, Aaron wants to take all the questions that you have today. And so there are two ways to ask questions. You can either raise your hand, and that lets us know that you just want to audibly or verbally ask a question with either your phone or your computer speakers, or you can type it into the chat box. We will take your questions as they come. There will also be time at the end. So let me know if anybody has questions about any of the housekeeping items. My name is Tracy Hansen, and I am the program manager of the Washington Center for Women in Business, or the WCWB, and we're the host of Let's Talk Business, and our entire mission is to help support women entrepreneurs, whether they're launching a new business, whether they're already in business, and want to take their business to the next level or be more profitable or more successful. We do this through webinars and in-person trainings, kind of like this, or a lot of one-on-one coaching, business coaching. You'd sit down with an advisor and they would help devise a plan to help you meet whatever that next goal is of yours. We do cover the entire state of Washington. If there's anybody outside of the state of Washington, there are women's business centers all over the country, and I'm happy to provide that link to you. To meet with us for the first time is free. After that, it's $25 for the hour, but we always have scholarships available. And then there is all of our contact information on the screen. So you could always reach out to us, talk about anything that we're talking about today, as well as really any issue that you might be coming across in your business. And with that, let's get to the meat of today. I'll make you, Aaron, the presenter now.
Great, thank you. Okay, hang on one second here.
There we go.
Okay, great. So you can see that on your computers there, everyone?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Please enter your audio PIN followed by the pound or hash sign.
All right, and everyone can hear me okay. Just want to confirm that too before I dive in.
Yeah, I can hear you great. And Terrell also says that they can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Well, as Tracy mentioned, I definitely encourage question and answers. I will kind of be presenting to the group here today, but a dialogue, even if we're not in person, is always my preferred way of talking to people. The content today, as you all know, because you signed up for it, is going to be focusing on the P&L. And before I kind of dive into what that is, I just want to tell you a little bit about me and our firm, just so you know that you're talking to somebody who knows what they're talking about. So our firm, ACR Business Consulting, that is actually me. I am the principal, and I call myself the Chief Business Optimizer. But we're here in Olympia, and we've been doing this type of business strategy and consulting work since 2011. Our areas of expertise, really as it relates to business owners, are taking your idea and moving it to implementation, typically by mapping it to kind of a financial statement track and beginning to kind of assign real numbers and value. Also looking at and identifying business efficiency opportunities. Again, that is also focused through looking at your financial statements and the profit and loss specifically, and I'll talk a bit about that. and then kind of designing operational strategies, and more importantly, at least to me, ways that you can track those. And by tracking, again, I'm kind of alluding to the idea of your profit and loss statement and other financial statements as the tools to accomplish that. If you are looking for a consultant, or you are looking for a partner that can perhaps help you think differently about your approach or business, as Tracy pointed out, the EDC is a fantastic partner. I've had the luxury of working with them in a few different initiatives. But if you want somebody that can kind of dive in and go for a particular level of depth, really where we've seen our success and our ability to partner with others is business owners who are trying to launch new lines of business or services. They kind of want to look at scenarios, if you will, before they just jump out and launch. They want to understand profitability by particular line of business or service. Sometimes you've got multiple revenue streams and you're not exactly sure which ones are making you the most money, if some of them are losing you money. And so doing that type of dissection and analysis work. And if you're kind of in the market or beginning to think about the need for financing or investment partnerships, obviously structuring your financial statements is a key goal of that, because that certainly is the language that most of those partners use. And then if you're a business that's experiencing rapid growth, or you're declining sales and you're kind of just on unsure footing, we've been able to come in and help kind of shore up the gaps and get business owners and businesses to a place where they feel more confident in what transitions are taking place. Specifically, actually, before I get going, my name is Aaron Rodriguez, and I do very much love finance, spreadsheets, and all things kind of data. I'm a finance manager, a finance degree background, a longtime banker. I've run and managed businesses myself, and really in the last several years have very much enjoyed serving in a consultative partnership capacity, where I've been able to help individuals and businesses take their ideas, their processes, and really dial them in. One of the ways that I do this is by starting at the level of financial statements. And financial statements in general, and again, I should preface, the goal of today's session is really a high-level overview focusing specifically on the profit and loss statement. If there's more detailed questions that you have, I want to encourage you to ask those, absolutely. And if they're perhaps a little too detailed for today, we can certainly connect offline, or I'm more than happy to follow up with Tracy or you directly. But if you walk out of here today, hopefully with the enthusiasm or shared enthusiasm that I have for the profit and loss statement as a tool, then I would call the hour that we get to spend together today successful. I like to think about the profit and loss statement as a story, because to me, we can get a little locked up, overwhelmed, confused, intimidated by the notion of numbers, specifically when we're using terms that don't really get used outside of when you're talking about financial statements. So I tend to introduce this as a story, and I like to think of it as my favorite business book. The primary reason for that is that it's a very objective story. It does not leave a lot of room for gray area and can really cut to the chase. Those are things I tend to like in other books as well, so maybe no surprise there. But if you really think about it as a story, it's only a 3-chapter book. And in those 3 chapters, you can glean a tremendous amount of insight, both insight as to what is actually taking place and insights into scenarios that have yet to unfold. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we take a look at a sample profit and loss statement. Just for your own knowledge, you may already be aware, but the profit and loss is really one of 3 financial statements that are most heavily used by businesses. The other is your balance sheet, which tracks your assets and liabilities, your owner's equity, and then a cash flow statement, which kind of shows you over a time period how your monies are coming in and being spent. It sort of helps with just managing big expenses, cash outlays, things like payroll, unforeseen expenses, etc. But the profit and loss really for a business owner that's just starting out or really in kind of the early stages of getting going, I believe, is the most useful tool. When I talk about the profit and loss as having 3 chapters, I want to make sure that the language is clear. And again, some of this is probably already not new to you, but just so we are all on the same page for our time together. Chapter 1 is really about income, and it can be referred to as sales. It can be referred to as revenue. There's even the notion of gross income versus net income. And gross just means essentially kind of income that has not had anything taken out of it yet. So basically what came in, true dollar earned, true dollar made, is your income. Chapter 2 talks about expenses. And I believe Chapter 2 is probably for anybody's P&L where most of the substance, most of the story lives, and most of the opportunity, frankly, to improve your business efficiency. Expenses can be referred to as costs, and that tends to be kind of the more common language. If you are in a business that's producing products or has to purchase any materials or anything in order to actually generate the item that you are selling, then you will and are familiar with the notion of cost of goods sold. These can be also referred to as cost of materials, sometimes referred to as direct materials. Basically, anything that you had to purchase to produce your items. For a restaurant, for example, that would be all of the food. For a manufacturing company, that would be any plastics, metals, etc., that had to be purchased in a raw form and then turned into whatever your product is. Another big category of expenses is labor. Labor is pretty self-explanatory, but it can also be carved up in a few ways. You can have direct labor costs. You can have indirect labor costs, administrative labor costs, etc. Those things are less important as it relates to kind of a general profit and loss, but they are important to know if you wish to do any deeper diving into certain lines of business, into certain product profitability. And I'll touch on that here shortly. Kind of the third and final category of expenses is referred to as overhead. In a very general sense, it's basically any expense that supports the making or selling of a product or service. And that key word there is support versus direct. So if you think about internet, insurance, electricity, printing, copying, kind of those bigger, more general buckets that you don't necessarily need to have printing in order to sell plated food at a restaurant. But those marketing materials that are printed are valuable in generating sales, but they're an overhead expense versus kind of a direct expense. Then the third and final chapter, which sums it all up pretty nice and neatly and without a lot of fuss, is your net income, also known as your net profit, also known as your bottom line, basically taking the true sales, true revenue that came into your business, minus all of your expenses, and then showing you how much money you've made. Any questions just about that outline before we move forward? Okay.
I don't see any come through.
Okay, great. So why spend any time, let alone an hour, just talking about a profit and loss? Well, I think understanding its purpose can hopefully help you walk away with a greater interest or enthusiasm for it as a genuine business tool. Profit and loss, and again, in a general sense, is an extremely useful tool if you would like to do any sort of financial modeling for your business or any financial modeling for products or services of your business. And when I say financial modeling, I'm talking about future projections and forecasting. One of the things that we do at ACR Business Consulting, and I think we do it extremely well, is financial modeling. Basically, if you want to have the notion of launching a new business, first you have to articulate all of the expenses that you expect or anticipate that business to incur. Then you have to think honestly about sales, and not just sales in a general sense, but sales over time. When you first start out, your sales might be conservative, and then by 6 to 9 to 12 months, you expect certain growth, and you're able to understand and account for that growth with a high degree of confidence. Well, all of that modeling can be done off of your profit and loss statement, and it can be done in ways that let you generate multiple scenarios. Those scenarios can allow you to account for real risks that you might be facing, risks such as overhiring, risks such as putting too much or not enough in marketing, foregoing accounting fees or other professional service fees. But the nice thing is these are all happening in simulated safe environment known as a spreadsheet. What you walk away with through these simulations and modeling is a very clear notion of what we would call the best path forward for your business. This same process can be applied to particular lines of service or products to determine if it makes sense to launch at this particular time, or see what the effects are on your bottom line, or specifically on your need to increase labor, to increase cost of goods sold, etc. And really, as we'll move into, and is kind of the primary focus of today, is the notion of setting up an Excel profit and loss template, and just how useful this can be for you as a business tool. And it's a business tool whether you have an idea and you're trying to simulate whether it makes sense to move forward and can be profitable and what that looks like, or you're a current business owner and you have QuickBooks, you have an accountant, but you may just want to be able to run your own scenarios in a much more simplified way. So we do very much encourage with our clients and anybody who's running a business to have this profit and loss template kind of in your toolkit. And with that, I'm going to move over to the sample one I have. We're going to dive in and start talking specifically about why the P&L is so useful and what it can do for you. Can everybody see the spreadsheet that appeared on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a sample profit and loss that I use. Obviously, the goal for your business, your organization, is to get clear on what the line items are that constitute the income, expenses sections of your profit and loss. And just so you know, this template, I'm more than happy to share with anybody that would like to use it as a starting point for your business or idea, potential venture. I tend to operate off of two tabs when I use my profit and loss. I have one that is, as I mentioned, for the notion of projections and budgeting, and I have one that is for when the business is already operating. And when we sort of keep with this theme of profit and loss as a story, I call those the introduction and the story. The introduction being your projections, things that have yet to come, but you are able to actually begin to see as a result of how you're doing your modeling. And if you look at the difference between these two, there really isn't much. But what I've gone ahead and highlighted here is this section in the intro section is showing you the percentage of each line item relative to your profit. If you look at the story section, it's actually the true amounts that your business is incurring in each line item that you're operating with. I want to start with the introduction template though. Working with percentages to me is an extraordinarily powerful way to get your profit and loss to talk to you. The reason for this is that if you think about it, obviously your goal here is to bring your total expenses as a percentage of your profits in under, therefore you know you're making money. And in this example here, this would be an example of a business that does have to incur cost of goods sold in order to produce products for sale. If your business is a service business like mine, I don't produce any products and therefore don't incur any cost of goods sold. This template works just the same. Basically, you would just say, I have 0% of my revenue as cost of goods sold. But if you are a business that does have certain percentages and you even want to begin to understand what the implications are of overpaying for product, this template lets you very easily put in hypothetical scenarios. What happens if I am able to control my cost of goods at 35%? Okay, it's going to cost me $175,000 of my projected revenue. But what happens if I was off and it's 65%? How does that affect my overall profit margin? You follow this same logic when you're looking at every line item that is relevant for you on the expense side as well, because you may not necessarily know what these dollar amounts are going to be once your business starts. So rather than trying to say, oh, I think it's $5,000, it's going to be $10,000, I really encourage business owners to come in and try to structure this from a percentage standpoint. And some of those percentages can be known by what I know you're all familiar with, are called industry benchmarks. And a lot of industries have businesses and enough businesses in them to begin to produce some of these benchmarks as starting points. One of the ones I talk about most specifically is the restaurant industry. And the restaurant industry is a fantastic example because they operate on very thin margins. They're literally working with a 5% to 10% margin of error. And if any of these expenses exceed certain benchmarks, there's a high likelihood that they're not making any money. So the EDC might be a great place to start if you are looking for certain benchmarks for expense line items. Additionally, Google searches, it literally says, what is the labor cost benchmark for insert your industry? And you'll find a lot of articles where that information has already been calculated and presented. But industry benchmarks can also pertain to cost of goods sold for your particular industry if you are producing. And again, restaurants are a good example. To give you just some context, we know from research that restaurants' cost of goods sold typically needs to be somewhere between 30 and we'll say 40%. Any restaurant that's operating above that cost of goods sold margin stands a very high likelihood of not succeeding. Rent and salaries are two other sort of big ticket expense items that all businesses incur. But when, again, continuing with our example of restaurants, we know rents for a restaurant, typically you want to keep those between 5 and 10%. If your business is contemplating leasing space or you're looking to expand, knowing what your industry benchmarks are for rent, for example, helps already do kind of a back of napkin assessment on whether you believe it's a useful or a smart strategic move to make those decisions. Wages and salaries or labor expenses, same thing. Again, for restaurants, those typically need to be somewhere between 25 and 35% of total revenue, or that it is too expensive for a restaurant to be functioning and looking to make money. Now, I'm not saying that you use these percentages as purely black and white, but when you're getting into and wanting to have a tool at your disposal that lets you run these scenarios, your profit and loss tool is extremely useful. We could literally sit here together and run through various scenarios for your line of business, saying, well, what happens, if we only allocate 3% to advertising? Okay, that's only about $5,200 of our projected revenue. Well, I know we want to use Facebook ads, and that's $600 a month. So right there, I'm already at $7,200 for the year, for example. So you start kind of using these percentages to give you baseline levels, always being cognizant of your total expense line and what your desired profit margin is. If your industry standard for business is a 15% profit margin, even though we're showing we're making money here, we're way out of line with that benchmark. So then my question is, why are we out of line? What's too high? Where can we look at and say, do we really need to pay that much for phone or internet, for example? So hopefully you get the sense that your P&L, without saying anything audibly, is talking to you. It requires a bit of insight by way of research to understand your benchmarks, but using percentage as a shared language, it's able to tell you, hey, I think you're out of line here. Hey, maybe you're not putting enough here. Hey, your profit margin looks great. What happens if you actually do increase your wages and salary and do look to hire that office manager? Or what happens if you try to want to increase your existing staff salary by way of a bonus structure or increase compensation? Any of the business questions that you're asking yourself on a daily basis, you can go back to this basic tool and merely play with percentage values and immediately see how that's going to affect you. And again, there's more detail, more research that oftentimes comes out of this, but as that back of napkin sketch, as a busy business owner who just has to kind of get a sense of, is this even feasible or not? This to me is one of the most useful and easiest tools to employ that supports you in educated decision making or educated guesstimating, even to start out with. Any questions about that notion, the profit and loss, the way it's structured, or this idea of utilizing percentages as kind of this shared language between you and your P&L?
None have come through.
Okay.
I might have spoken too soon. Go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, sorry. I raised my hand, but I don't think you guys saw it. My question is, when you're talking about these benchmarks and, per industry, is that by region as well, or would it be for the industry no matter where you are in the state or in the country? How do you find the specifics on that?
That's a great question. I would say, in a general sense, if the best you could come up with is kind of nationwide benchmarks, again, that's a great place to start. Now, one of the areas that it probably does make a ton of sense to go do a deeper dive by region, for example, and you might already be alluding to this, would be in labor costs. Because, you can look at Washington State as one of the most expensive minimum wages, and I mean expensive, not in a negative sense. And so if you were pulling industry benchmarks from another state with a much lower minimum wage, then you're correct. Making those projections and trying to get your labor costs relative to those benchmarks would be an unrealistic goal. Other things, though, tend to be pretty consistent. There may be some nuance to particular materials or supplies, that are purchased in various regions. But if you think about that, if you really needed to make that level of discernment, most likely you're looking at tax structures by state to determine what the variances are there. So, for example, if you needed to buy $100,000 of aluminum, and I'm really just making this up, so no offense or not intending to sound like I know the aluminum industry, if any of you are working in that arena. But for a simple example, if you're buying $100,000 of aluminum and you're looking at benchmarks nationwide, you may want to make sure that if there's any state tax or any tax that's associated with Washington State that isn't necessarily relevant or is higher than other states, that you take that into account, because obviously you'll have to incur those costs as part of the acquisition of the materials needed to produce your products. Did that address your question?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And not to put Tracy on the spot, but I do think the EDC is really a good place to start when you're trying to get those benchmarks. And Tracy, you know, if there's anything you want to add to that, it would also be even useful for me to know.
Yeah, absolutely. To get, you know, getting those initial benchmarks. Likely it would be Christine Buckley that they would sit down with, and she was just on the line earlier. I wish she was still here to speak to it. But absolutely, because it can be so confusing trying to figure out those initial things. So yes, absolutely, we could sit down and talk through how all that would work.
Great. And you bring up a good question, it makes me think of another thing worth mentioning. Typically, you know, most businesses, there's going to be some pretty high kind of finite, definite costs. Obviously, if you're manufacturing or producing products, your cost of goods sold is going to be one of the larger expenses. So kind of keeping that in mind. And then the second highest expense most likely is going to be any wages or salaries that are required. And from there, then where a lot of profitability is made and lost is kind of in the trenches, you know, in these other areas where you might say, oh, you know, 4%, that's not a ton. But if you're able to trim it down to 3%, and, you know, depreciation is a bad example there. But let's say, you know, if I was able to bring my accounting and legal fees down to 2.9%. You know, I'm adding, should have looked at that number first. I'm adding about $1,700 to my bottom line. And that's why I really like to look at percentages, because if you can even shed 0.5%, 0.25% in various line items, that can add up to significant dollars for you. And without the correlation between that line item and the cost, between that line item and your total revenue, and that correlation being reflected as a percentage, it's difficult to kind of drill down to that level. And it can be difficult to start playing with scenarios, because if you said, well, it's 6,800, well, what happens if it goes down to 5,000? You know, there's really, using finite numbers is better served once your business is up and running, because you have real numbers now that you are trying to manage effectively. The other thing that this particular template has in place, and it's just basic, but it just, again, my goal is to give myself quick visual indicators to run through this, allocate based on line items by percentage, always gauging where I'm landing, and at the same time kind of giving me this idea of if I'm too high. So let's say my industry benchmark was only 4%, I come to find out, for rent, you know, and my labor benchmark was only 40%. Setting up these basic, formatting, conditional formatting in your spreadsheet, again, just lets this tool communicate with you, immediately telling me, oh man, this line item is out of whack. Doesn't mean that I scrap it, but it just kind of helps me see, in case a partner at the EDC or a banking partner or a potential investor or a consultant such as myself, it's already showing us where the potential areas are. It's already highlighting questions. As a business owner, these type of things, I hope, make you feel more confident, more savvy in what you're doing on a daily basis, because you're already aware, hey, our rent is high, but let me tell you why we went ahead and moved forward with this anyway. Or our wages and salaries are above what industry benchmark is, but here's the reason why we invested in that additional salesperson. And these are conversations that you can be having with yourself, obviously, but certainly become extremely more relevant when you are looking to bring partners in who are trying to assist you in growing your business. Moving over to the notion of the story, it's very similar. So there really isn't too much more that I want to outline here. But the distinction in the way that the spreadsheets are formulated is obviously once you have accounted for a single business year, or even if you've had multiple years and you just kind of want to start from your most recent year or even an average of your previous years, you can go in and just put in the specific dollar amounts here. And obviously it works the other way now. So, but now you can say, okay, well, last year, my rent was $18,000 and, oh, that's 6% of my total operating, of my total revenue, man, and my benchmark's 5%. So again, when it comes to profitability, obviously driving sales, good products, good services are key. But what our firm focuses on, and where I sincerely believe there's tremendous opportunity to make money, is in the management of the expense side of your P&L. And looking at what is it telling you and how can you shave off even a half, a quarter of a percentage point across various expenses that your business needs to operate. Any questions in a general sense about your P&L, even questions about your own business P&L?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you find businesses that focus too much on those expenses and limit their income potential because of it?
That's an awesome question. Can you give me just a little bit more context? Because I think I might know what you're after, but I want to make sure I'm addressing it specifically. So when you say focus too much on expenses and limit income, just kind of walk that out a bit for me.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and I'll say this is not the state of my business at the moment, but I'm totally not there yet. But just way down the road, if when a business is well established and they're growing, and say they get to a point where it's like, oh, we've reached kind of our maximum with what we're doing now. Now we want to refine things a little bit so that we can bring more in and keep growing. And then they go, okay, well, let's see what kind of costs we can cut, instead of saying, okay, let's see where we can bring more income on what we're doing now. I personally, I've seen, the last employer I worked for had that happen, and they lost a lot of business because they started cutting costs where they were giving back perks to their customers, and a lot of customers left. That was the example that I saw, but I'm not sure how common that is, or what ways that can happen.
No, that's fantastic. What I want to say about this is, in a general sense, I am a firm believer that there is within this expense section of any business, there are things that I sincerely believe are costs, and then there are things that I believe are investments. And investments are things that might be difficult to quantify. They still appear on the expense side of your business, but a savvy business owner who is kind of managing both the revenue and expense side doesn't necessarily say, oh, I got to go hire another person. That's a cost. They view it as a strategic hire that, if done appropriately, will actually increase revenue. In the short term, for example, yes, while that person is getting his or her feet under them, there may be an expense above and beyond what your normal budget is. And so thinking about and doing that type of scenario play allows you to account for that, as I mentioned earlier, kind of over a time horizon. And so just using your example, if you talk about the customer perks that were cut, one of the things that pops up for me would be to look at the P&L of that organization and get an idea of what was the total percentage of sales that those perks were accounting for. And more importantly, was it only a handful of the total clients that were getting those perks? Was it one client that was sort of getting all of the perks? Because there's a ton of additional, what I call metadata in there that begins to help you further unpack. What we're looking at this P&L is at the 10,000 foot level. But what you're talking about, and you're absolutely spot on, is drilling down and constantly asking those questions. And so it is this dialogue between you and your profit and loss that says, 5% of total sales is in customer discounts. Okay. Is that in line with the industry benchmark? No, it seems high. Okay, that's interesting. All right, well, which clients are actually receiving it? Well, it looks like it's only about 10% of our total clients. Interesting. What is the total revenue that those particular clients account for? Well, it looks like they account for 70% of total revenue. Okay, that's intriguing. And so right there, without even seeing it, there's 6 questions that I would just continue to explore, because it could even turn out that, wow, actually, there's a correlation between the amount of revenue and the amount of perks that a customer is receiving. And it could end up having made sense to be more aggressive in offering those perks based on that type of analysis. Does that address your question?
Really helpful. And, seeing it from my perspective, it's really hard to say, are they just not looking at it correctly? And I would say maybe the answer was yes, they're not looking at it so much when making those decisions. So that's really helpful.
One of the things that's honest, and this is hilarious because I'm a business owner too. When you're wearing the hat of the person who has to write the checks and the money's going out the door, it is difficult to think about your expenses as potential investments, or to think about not cutting costs as the right way to go. So these outside resources, the EDC, consultants, objective colleagues in the industry, they can look at it, and because they're not the one that has to write the check, it's super easy to say, man, I could pocket $2,000 here. And in that decision, your foresight is completely non-existent. So I always encourage, and that's partly where we have seen a lot of success in our business. When growth starts to happen rapidly, you feel like, I got to go higher like crazy. And that isn't necessarily the right way to operate either. When revenue starts to shrink, you begin to think, I got to cut costs. And I would encourage you, pause, start with a question, ask your P&L. It'll turn around and tell you, hey, you might want to explore this. And that dialogue, even a half an hour with the P&L, if you know what to ask, is going to do 2 things. One, it's going to move you out of that kind of fight or flight mindset. It's going to keep you re-engaged into this creative mindset that got your business off the ground in the first place. And that's really where you want to be functioning from as much as possible. Any other questions, just in a general sense, about the notion of profit and loss, about your own profit and loss, how to structure it, etc.? This is I love these type of times to connect with folks, because there's a lot of nuance to this. And obviously what I showed you today is a very generic boilerplate P&L, but I just wanted to provide you with this overview, high level overview, mind you, but hopefully give you just an initial perspective, or maybe a reinforced enthusiasm for the P&L, how it really is a useful business partner for you. And really, I believe, maybe I'm just going a little nuts now because I look at these all the time, but it's an objective partner for you. It will turn around and shoot you straight always. And that's what I've always loved about it. There's really no gray area. And if I'm listening, there are a host of secondary and tertiary questions that come out of these scenario forecasting and hypotheticals when I'm engaging with a P&L. And that's regardless of industry. That's the other piece that's worth noting. I can get asked to look at a hospital's P&L or an insurance agency's P&L or a restaurant's P&L, and it doesn't matter the industry. We can discern based off of this notion of going after benchmarks relative to current expenses as a percentage of sales, a tremendous amount, and drill down into really what the root causes or potential opportunities are for a business. And I want you to have that same level of enthusiasm. And even if you're still uncertain how to do it, just know that this tool can get you there. So rather than waking up saying, man, I don't know what the next 6 months are going to look like, or we've just got a new contract, how's that going to affect staffing? Those questions that you're asking every single day, wake up and say, you know what? They're in my P&L and I don't know how to start. So now at least you're asking the right question. Where's the help I can get? Instead of saying, I'm not sure what to do, or just acting kind of without first going through that exercise that keeps you grounded, keeps your creative brain on, and not your fight or flight brain. Well, Tracy, if there's no extra or additional questions, I guess I can hand it back over to you.
Well, great. Thank you so much. And I love the way that you put that, the fight or flight. We see that coming in all the time where people are panicked about their finances. And so these tips to kind of take out that pressure and really understand and use this tool for your growth, I think is so important and so exciting. And I hope all of you are able to take this away. And this is being recorded, so if you need to watch it again when you're looking at your own finances and things like that, please feel free to do so. Now, if people have questions, Aaron, can they reach out to you directly, or would you like them to come to me and then send them to you, or how did you put up your contact information? I can't remember.
I didn't. So clearly, I'm a terrible marketer. So if any of you are in marketing business, I probably need to talk to you. But yes, you can email me directly. And let's see here if I can get. Give me 1 second. We're going to do this just to help out here. Give me 1 second. I am just adding contact information, which is hilarious.
And we just had a question. Can the WCWB help? Absolutely. On these types of things, as well as a lot of times this links into, like Aaron said, maybe it's marketing or social media or another area of finance, or how do you even hire somebody, that sort of thing. So yes, we are always a resource for you as well.
All right, so coming your way. Let's see here. There we go. Do you see that?
Yes.
Great. So yes, email me, call me. I mean, I love the dialogue. I love a cup of coffee, even if you're chewing on stuff. We offer 1 hour initial free consultation, even I can do quite a bit on the back of a napkin, as I'm sure Tracy and her colleagues at the EDC can. So I just ultimately want to put in a plug. You don't have to know how to do everything. There are tools that can certainly help you, or at least give you a solid footing from which to begin your questions. But finding partners, there's always resources for partners and people that are looking to help. So And I openly and happily consider myself one of those to our businesses in the community. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, even if we wouldn't have the capacity to help everybody, even if we wanted to. So yes, we're so thankful to have you as a resource, Erin, and highly recommend people reach out if you have questions or want to further this conversation. Well, I haven't seen any more questions come in, and that's fine. If you think of any after this, feel free to email them to Erin or myself. I'll send out an email a little bit later this afternoon with the recording, and I'll include his contact information in there as well. And feel free to reach out to us. Oh, there'll also be a survey. Please take the survey and let us know what you think. Oh, and Allison, let's see. We have another question. Your generic template for the P&L, Erin, is that on your website, or do you want them to contact you for that?
Whatever's the easiest. It's not on my website currently, but I can either share it with you, Tracy, and if you have contact information from folks who've registered, you can certainly send it out, or you can. Any of you are welcome to email me and just say, hey, send me that template, and I can make sure you get it. But it's really basic. But again, at least it starts you out. There's some simple formatting. It already has the formulas in. You merely just have to change out your expense line to make sure that it aligns with your business, and then you're off and running.
Yeah, if you're able to send that to me, I'll at least send it to the people who were on the call today, so that they can get started. And
Perfect.
Allison, I see you have your hand raised again. Did you have another question?
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to wait until a good time. So my question earlier, you mentioned, using an Excel spreadsheet to do this. And obviously, if we have this template that's pre-made, it would be really easy to start with that. But would you recommend somebody to use QuickBooks too, and then do this kind of separately? Or can you kind of do this, those 3 statements you talked about, in place of tracking in a program like QuickBooks? Or what do you think?
So the benefit of QuickBooks is that it's really dialed in terms of, if you're posting revenue, it's going to allow you to create your deposit tickets that align with your bank. If you have vendors that you need to pay, it's going to manage your payables. Those payables obviously are coming off of your balance sheet. So I'm definitely a proponent of an accounting software, but a lot of accounting software doesn't let you do this forecasting because it's providing you mostly reports, although they can be exported into Excel. Then you got to go in and do all of the formulas. So really, anytime I'm starting to chew on an idea, if I'm wondering, hey, what happens if we increase revenue by 10%? What happens if we look to allocate some more money to marketing, for example? These questions, I think, are best started in a very basic tool, because most of the time you're walking out into the future to do that type of thinking. And while QuickBooks, as an example, does have a financial forecasting tool, I find it to be rather complex, at least when I just want to look at some basic questions I have. So I use the 2, QuickBooks for me, and I'll leave you kind of with this. And there's no disrespect at all to our accounting professionals. They have a very real role. But a quote I once heard kind of stuck with me, and it was, finance begins where accounting ends. And accounting to me is very much about looking backwards, making sure that everything is lined up, making sure that all things are accounted for, and giving you a solid foundation from which to walk into the future. But that's where financial analysis starts. That's where the fun, creative questions. What happens if we want to acquire that business? What happens if we go after companies that are only generating revenue of X amount, right? These are the big business questions. And yes, there's a little bit more nuance than to just my 2-tab Excel spreadsheet, but not much. It really just boils down to what questions can you formulate to determine how deeply down into your profit and loss you drill. how granular do you have to get in order to get a confident answer?
Does
That's
that answer
great.
your question, Allison?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Wow. Well,
One
yes,
last
thank
thing.
you.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Well, one last thing, and I realize now for my own feedback, I'll make sure and close this loop. For you as business owners, waking up with your list of questions, keep those questions. Know that a lot of those questions honestly can be configured to run through your profit and loss. And I'm saying this from experience, maybe not how it's initially formulated by you, but if you said, Aaron, this is what I'm chewing on, I could most likely turn that into a question which we could then review your profit and loss to begin to formulate an answer. And I want to make that notion because you don't have to think in terms of numbers and finances. You think in terms of the way that your brain works, the way that's made your business successful, the way that keeps you motivated. But don't stop asking those questions. Just put them in front of people who can say, I hear what you're saying. Now, I bet if we went and talked to your P&L and said it this way, it might be able to start giving us some insights.
Very cool. I think that that's a great point, and yeah, I strongly recommend everybody do that. That sounds great. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. I know we're closing in on the hour, and everybody might have 1 o'clock things that they need to get to. So cannot thank you enough, Aaron, for your time today, your expertise, all these tips and great information. And thank you everybody that was out with us today and spent your time listening. We definitely see a huge correlation with successful business owners and people who take time to learn new content like this. So thank you. Rachel asks, is it possible to send the template? Yes. Aaron's going to send that to me, and I will send it to you guys in the follow-up email, Rachel. Good question. Well, with that, I will end the webinar for all of us, and I'll hope to see you all next week. Have a good one.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, everybody.